If every unit you plan feels like starting from scratch, the problem probably isn't that you don't know how to plan. It's that you don't have a repeatable framework to plan from. Today, I want to share the shift that changed everything for me and what I learned while building a brand new unit live in front of a group of teachers. Welcome to the Secondary Teacher Podcast, the podcast for middle and high school teachers juggling multiple preps to get the strategies to reduce overwhelm so that you don't have to choose between being an effective teacher and prioritizing important relationships. I'm your host, Khristen Massic, a 10-year high school engineering teacher, former middle school assistant principal, and teacher coach. Every week, we will discuss strategies, systems, and time-saving tips to help you not only survive but thrive as a multiple prep teacher. This is the first episode in a new series, and if you've been following along this summer, you already know we've spent a lot of time talking about planning systems, repeatable structures, and reducing decision fatigue. Today, we're going one level deeper because we're not just talking about the idea of a planning framework anymore. We're talking about what it actually looks like to use one, step by step, decision by decision, to build a real unit from scratch. Over the next 4 episodes, I'm going to unpack the Introduce, Practice, Produce framework one piece at a time. But today, I want to start with the story of how I learned, or maybe relearned, something I should have already known. Right now, I'm running the very first alpha round of the unit planning lab, small group intentional. I wanted to test not just the planning process, but how to teach the planning process. And honestly, one of the biggest lessons I've learned so far had nothing to do with unit planning. It had everything to do with teaching. The first week, I spent a lot of time explaining my framework, explaining my thinking, explaining why I made certain decisions. And it made complete sense in my head, but I could tell it wasn't landing the way I wanted it to. And then I got feedback from one of the participants. She's a listener, someone who teaches multiple preps, and exactly the kind of teacher I built this for. And she was honest enough to tell me that the way I was teaching it wasn't clicking yet. And honestly, I knew this, not from the unit planning, from coaching. The professional development lessons I've valued most in my career weren't the ones where someone stood up and explained a concept really well. They were the ones where I could watch someone think through a problem in real time, where the modeling was so clear I could see every decision as it happened. And there I was, running a planning lab, explaining instead of modeling. So in week 2, I changed everything. I opened a blank planning document and I started planning a real unit with everyone watching. Not talking about planning, actually planning. And I started leaving visible notes inside the document, not just answering the planning questions, but writing out why I made the choices I did, so participants could see the thinking, not just the outcome. Almost immediately, everything shifted. The unit that I chose to plan live was for a brand new 3D printing course, and the very first decision we had to make was surprisingly hard. Where do we start? When I looked at the standards, the obvious answer would have been safety or printer maintenance or the different types of 3D printers. All important, all in the standards. But I kept thinking about the students because if you've taught electives or CTE, you know there's an unofficial deadline during those first couple weeks of school. Students are still adjusting schedules, still deciding whether they want to stay in your class. Some of them didn't even choose your class. They just ended up there because of scheduling. So instead of asking what's listed first in the standards, I asked a different question. What experience will convince students this class is worth staying in? And my answer surprised even me a little. I wanted them printing as quickly as possible, not because printing is the only thing they'll learn, but because it's the reason many of them signed up. And getting them to that moment early, letting them feel what the class is actually about, changes everything about their investment in what comes next. That decision completely reorganized how I sequenced the rest of the unit. Not because I ignored the standards, because I became more intentional about the order students would experience them. And I think this is something we don't say out loud enough. The standards tell you what students need to learn. They don't tell you the best order for students to experience that learning. That's still your job, especially if you're teaching electives, CTE, or any course where you're building curriculum from scratch without a provided scope and sequence. Planning isn't just organizing content. It's making instructional decisions. And those decisions get a lot lighter when you have a repeatable way to think through them so you're not starting from zero every single time you open a blank document. That's why I use the introduce, practice, produce framework for every unit I build. Not because education needs another acronym, but because I was drowning in decisions and I needed a way to stop reinventing the wheel every time I sat down to plan. At its simplest, every lesson serves one of three purposes. You're either introducing something new, helping students practice it, or giving students an opportunity to produce something that shows what they've learned. That's it. Three purposes. Every lesson fits somewhere. And I'm not going to go deep on each one today because that's exactly what the next 3 episodes are for. What I want you to take from this episode is simpler than that. Every lesson has a job, and when you're clear about what that job is, planning becomes a different kind of question. Not what activity should I do, but what do my students actually need right now? Those are very different questions, and the second one is so much easier to answer. Before the next episode, here's one thing worth doing. If you're planning a unit this summer, don't start by collecting activities. Don't open Pinterest, don't scroll TPT. Instead, ask yourself one question first. What experience do I want students to have first and why? Not what's listed first in your standards. What do students need to encounter first for the rest of the class to make sense? That's your starting point. And once you have that, the next decision gets a little clearer. And then the next one. Planning gets lighter when you're making one intentional decision at a time instead of trying to design everything at once. Next episode, we're going deep on introduction lessons because I think a lot of teachers have plenty of hook ideas, but they aren't always introducing the right thing. And that small distinction between a hook that's engaging and an introduction that actually does instructional work completely changes what the rest of the unit can do. That one's coming up next. If you'd like to follow along as you work through your own planning this summer, grab the free secondary teacher planning calendar in the show notes. It's the same structure I use to map out units before I ever start building individual lessons, and it'll help you organize your thinking without feeling like you have to plan the entire school year at once. And if you've been listening this summer thinking, I don't just want a framework, I want someone to help me think through my actual unit, I'm opening another round of the Unit Planning Lab in August. You can join the waitlist in the show notes now. That group will get early details, bonuses, and first access before registration opens publicly. Before you go, one question. When you sit down to plan a unit, are you spending more time making decisions or making progress? Because those aren't always the same thing. Finish something that makes tomorrow lighter. I'll see you next time.